Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of ClueCon Weekly. This week, joining us is Clive Lansink from New Zealand, an expert in accessible technology. He has a degree in engineering and another in law, I think, and is a long time expert again in accessibility and all disability. And thank you for joining us today, Clive.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
First of all, would you like to give us a quick introduction about yourself? You have a fascinating story, so it's.
Ah, all right. Well, I've been totally blind since birth, and as a kid, I had a big interest in electronics. And when I got to go to university, I went to study electrical engineering. And the people at the university said, well, what are you going to do with that? Because as a blind person, you're not
Hmm.
likely to be able to use a degree in electrical engineering. But I persisted. And it was just at the time of, in the mid 70s, just at the time of microprocessors. And I started to take an interest in learning to program. And my first job after I graduated was writing machine code for microprocessors, um, and so that's when I really got interested in programming. I've done a lot of things since then,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't do machine code anymore, but that's how I got started. So I had that background in electronics, knew about machines and electronics, but I also I couldn't pick up a soldering iron, um, but I could do software. And it was just at that time when things were starting to happen in that space, and that's how I sort of got started. And um, so I've then just went into various software jobs. But one of the things I have always been keen on is this problem of getting information out to blind people. And
Mm-hmm.
so that was what led me to start playing with interactive voice response type systems. And I, 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 I set up a small system here in New Zealand to help blind people get access to information. So you could just record. People could record stuff on it, and it was like menu driven. So different clubs and groups and entities had a space on that system, and they could leave their own information, and then blind people could ring that. They would phone that system, and then they could see what was going on. And that kind of then developed into more of a news service. We started getting newspapers on board with it. But that was at the time people were still reading that. So volunteers would be reading the newspapers from from their homes. They had to try to make sure the kids weren't making too much noise. But they were reading local newspapers. People couldn't access this information in any other way.
Mm-hmm.
If you lived in a small town, you didn't, that was the only way to read a newspaper if you were blind. And later we were getting into, I guess, 2005, that sort of time frame was when I we started to get text electronically from newspapers, and then we started to use synthetic speech to read it. And yeah, so that's just been one of those things that has you know it dominated some of what I've been doing. It's probably the most interesting project because it never died. It's still going.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it and it was called the Telephone Information Service, and it's just become TIS for short. And most blind people in New Zealand, now New Zealand is not a big country, right? We're only 5 million people, but most blind people in New Zealand know what TIS means. And so it's still going, even though nowadays maybe it's just older
Yeah, it's
people who
different.
have who have the telephones to phone into a system like that. People
And
with smartphones, they still use it too, but they of course have the benefit of being able to go online and get information that way. So and of course that's what brought me to FreeSWITCH, because in that original hardware was Dialogic stuff, and some of your people will know what that is, the old timers.
mhm,
But when that all came to an end, I was asked to recreate the system, and I looked around for a new way of doing it, and I discovered several voice over IP type stacks, if you like, or packages,
yeah.
and FreeSWITCH won out. I just it just seemed to present well to me when I started playing with it. I'm a Windows user, so I am a little bit restricted in that respect, in the sense that there are
Well, I mean, you can still do a
well,
lot.
but FreeSWITCH was there for the taking, and it just had an exe file I could just install, and I
It's
didn't have to
not the
worry.
Windows it used to be. The
No,
current
no,
the current
it,
versions of Windows are much, much better
yeah,
in
yeah,
that
yeah.
regard.
And look, it's worked very well for me. It's not something I do a lot of. It's not my, I mean, some people just work all the time in communications. That's not me. I, I I do software more as a hobby these days,
Hmm.
and I'm kind of semi-retired now anyway. So I've never been in the sort of telecommunications industry as an expert. It's more for me. It's more just solving a problem. What do I need to do to solve this problem? And if I can find the building blocks to put it together, then that's what I do. And that's how FreeSWITCH worked out for me. So
Oh,
yeah, so we were able to recreate that system, and like I said, it's still running today. Now it's entirely on. There's no hardware involved anymore. It's just a computer on a network, and still answering calls. And everything is run using FreeSWITCH on that system. But now I'm sort of spreading into smart speakers and things like that, where um, blind people can. I'm developing a skill which will allow blind people to interact with the same information that's on this system. Um, so it's just another way of getting to that same information.
yeah. So a few questions on TIFF because it sounds really interesting.
Mm.
Could you give us a quick example of how it works? Like, what do people do when they're interacting with the system?
Well, let's look at it from two angles. First of all, you might be a local sports club, or you might be a consumer organization, and um, the you've got a information you want to get out to people. So w- we have assigned that a group a point on a menu. So if you might have so your main menu, and then number one might be consumer organizations, and number two might be information on say COVID-19, etc. So if you're a consumer organization, you're going to have a spot in number one. You might be number one, and so we've given you a menu, and then you can put what you like on your menu. So you can use a telephone, or you can record your audio on a computer and then upload it. But what you're doing is then you're creating information that is spoken, or you've provided it in text form, and it's going to be spoken by text to speech. And you create your menus. So a group might say, okay, well, our option 3 is going to be our latest minutes of our committee meeting, and our option 4 is going to be our newsletter. Um, and so these groups are responsible for recording their own information. And so they can do that very easily. There's anyone who can record can do it. You either use a telephone and you log in and you make your recordings, or you use your computer and you make your recordings and you then upload them. So by assigning these different spaces to different groups, we've then got different groups recording stuff, but also we have or the Blind Low Vision, which is the main organization here in New Zealand. They have whole studios that they've got people recording professionally, and they will also put that stuff onto menus. So again, it's categories of information, and blind people can telephone in and they can hear that information. So it bypasses the whole process of recording information on cassette and then copying those cassettes or onto CDs, onto memory sticks. It bypasses all of that, so people can just access the information they want. But now in the current situation then is more and more people are now using smart speakers, and so you've got a database of information, and so the intention is that a blind person can go to that skill and they can say, okay, I want to know, I want Blind Citizens New Zealand Auckland branch minutes, or Blind Citizens New Zealand Wellington branch newsletter, or the latest you've got on COVID-19, or
Okay.
whatever it might be, and you'll get a list of results, because all those articles are they're on a menu somewhere, but they're also indexed with a title and a description, and so you can do a full text search, and if the speaker can understand what you're asking for, and it makes a call to the database, then it's going to get that information back, and then the blind person can listen to that. So it's all about making it easy for people with information that they've got to give, and making it easy for them to make that information available in a way that is easy for blind people to access it. Now, obviously, you have got switched on blind people, and perhaps younger blind people. They can just find their ways to websites anyway, and they don't need perhaps a system quite like this. But you're dealing with a lot of people who are losing their sight. So
Yeah.
even somebody in their 40s, 50s, whatever, life's good, but suddenly they've got a problem. They're not seeing things so well. They go to the doctor. The doctor says, "I'm sorry to tell you, but your sight's on the way out." Those people
That's
aren't.
a very good point. There's not only
you know,
people
yeah,
we think of blind people as they've been blind for a
sort
long
of
time, but
highly
you could.
independent. Well, maybe, but you've got to start with some people are starting with nothing. As if you've lived all your life as a sighted person, suddenly you are now facing the prospect of going blind, or you've had an operation and it just happened overnight. You had an accident. I do know, good friends of mine did the wrong thing. Car went through the windscreen, gone. Right, just like that, and they have to build their lives from scratch. Now, you know, it's a long way from there to learning how to use a screen reader and going onto a website and just being fully independent. So a system like what I'm talking about, it just can easily fill that gap. Once you can use a telephone, you're able to use that system, and then you can go from there. Learn to use simple websites, and then learn to use more advanced websites, and so on. So we see this information system as just a helpful way of getting all sorts of information into a place where blind people can access it. But if you can access information in other ways, no one's going to tell you you can't do that, right? So that's that's my philosophy on that.
What's the application written in aside from FreeSWITCH? What
So
other
yeah,
moving parts are there?
okay. So essentially, my favorite programming language is Python.
Oh, nice.
And when I cottoned on to FreeSWITCH, I learned how to monitor the all the events, how to sit on a telnet, how to get into a telnet session, and then process all the events that come back from FreeSWITCH that tell you, when a call is here and what key was pressed and all of that sort of stuff. Um, so the essential application is written in Python,
Mhm.
and there's a web interface as well, and that is the basics of that is WordPress with a PHP script,
Oh,
and
nice.
that is making function calls to my Python application, um, and that is the primary way that people administer the system, is using a web interface. And then if you're using a smart speaker, that is also making a function call back to that Python application. And so that's what's at the center of it. There's several different moving parts that work together, as you put it. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, there's so Python, PHP, the usual suspects. There's a
Yes,
lot
yes,
in
I'm
open
afraid
source.
I'm afraid that's right, and even a bit of Java, to help with the
Oh,
interface.
wow.
But
That's
uh, that is not my area of strength. So, but I have, like I said, if I need to solve a problem, I will work out how to solve the problem and teach myself enough to solve the problem, and hopefully not create new ones. But um, so I've had to learn some Java to to make certain fields unavailable on a form, if the values aren't correct, etc. So things like that. But like WordPress is the primary framework for the web interface of it, and Python is the primary language for the for communicating with FreeSWITCH.
so widening the net a little. ClueCon Weekly, we try to talk about open source whenever we can, and there's always a lot.
Mm.
Do you think the open source community is doing a good job in providing accessibility tools, or are most of those commercial?
Well, it varies a lot.
Hmm.
Um, it really does. I don't want to sort of speak good or bad, but of different groups. But let's just take WordPress, for example, does have a strong commitment to accessibility. It's probably the reason why I chose WordPress. I did have a little play with Drupal, and they also had a strong commitment to accessibility, but somehow WordPress just more appealed to me, so I ended up settling on WordPress. And like I said, it that's a good example, I think, of where you've got a strong commitment to accessibility. It doesn't mean
Mhm.
that everything is going to be accessible, because if you sit down as a developer and you're going to write your own plugin, there's lots of ways that you're going to break, if you want to, that
Oh
you're going
yeah.
to break the accessibility rules, right? So no one can stop you from doing that, really. But WordPress does have some very good rules for developers to follow,
Oh,
and
nice. I didn't know.
they do, yeah, they do. Um, and if you stick to their sort of recipes for doing things, recipes for presenting information, etc., then it's very likely to be what you're going to create is very likely to be accessible. And that kind of brings to another point, because I often have arguments with um, people in the industry about accessibility, because it's often felt that making things accessible is expensive, and my argument is, well, actually, um, right from the time you write your first line of HTML, that was going to be perfectly accessible. But no one does that these days. But if you choose a um, a, a, a a framework, a content management framework that is committed to accessibility, then actually you've got to work hard to make it inaccessible, right? And so what really happens is, I suspect that a lot of websites, when they are first developed, actually probably are accessible, but it's then the layers that people put over the top of that to get a particular visual presentation. That's when people break accessibility. And what people have to learn to do is learn to do that visual stuff in a way that doesn't break the accessibility. Um, so you can have interactive maps and things like that, but if you do it the right way, then it can still be an accessible experience. And that's very simplistic, but like
Yeah,
I said, the person who just sits down and creates something simple using a well-established content management system, it's very likely that's going to be accessible. It's
yeah,
when it
that
gets it's when it gets into the more sophisticated stuff that it becomes inaccessible. But like I said, that's it, if it was done the right way in the first place, chances are it's going to be accessible, and then it's not expensive, right? It's only expensive to fix the mistakes of making them inaccessible, and that
the
can
same
be
thing
expensive.
applies
Yeah.
to other aspects of using WordPress, like and in general using established open source tools.
Mm,
For example, SEO, search engine optimization of websites
yep.
made with WordPress. If you don't do anything weird and just keep the page as is, it will work great for Google too, because it's
Sure.
already set up to be. Plus, accessibility and searchability do go hand in hand. Like if your content
Yeah.
is laid out correctly, it will work for both worlds. So it's very important for people to know that, I think.
And it also works for things like when people want to do remote automated testing. Again, the hooks for doing that are very closely related to the hooks that are used for screen readers to work. So a screen reader, we call them screen readers, but nowadays they're not really reading the screen at all. They're
Oh yeah, that's.
actually
I'm curious. Yeah.
yeah, they're actually interacting with the operating system and requesting information from the operating system about what's this control, what can it do, what can you tell me about its current value, what can you tell me about its choices, and if everybody behaves and follows the rules of the operating system, then the screen reader can get a complete picture, but it's not a real picture of the application you're using. What control are you on? Is it a list box? Is it an edit box? So that will determine what keys you can use to interact with it. And the screen reader can say, okay, well, I can tell you this is a slider and it's currently at 40%, or I can tell you it's a list box and you're on, a particular item in that list box. And all of that is working because the operating system provides um, a whole user
Hmm.
interface, application interface for the screen reader developers to use. Now, if you're using a device like an iPhone or a Mac, um, then Apple, I think, don't provide that API. They provide the screen reader, and you have to use that screen reader. But
I think
fortunately, it's a
that's
very
correct.
good
Yeah.
one. It's a very good one. But I think they do that because um, that's part of their security commitment. Because I think that um, the APIs that are used for screen readers can be abused. But like I said, they're also used for automated testing and other things like that as well. So I think we have to learn to live with those things, and hopefully there are sufficient safeguards in there
Well, I have a
for that.
obligatory question as a developer to a developer. What editor do you use? Like, I'm curious, which how do you write code?
All right. Look, a long time ago, I used an editor called TextPad and another one
I know
called
that.
Brief. Yeah. But I wrote my own, and my own editor you couldn't use because it only does speech. It has no user interface. Sorry, it has no
Oh,
visual. And what it turns out, I think that that writing an editor, most of the work is actually in the user interface.
oh, that's
If you
true. Yeah.
if you write an editor that only has to as you move the cursor, it only has to speak whatever word or character you are on. That turns out to be quite simple, and so I have my favorite editor is my own text editor, and it's just basically Python. It's almost like a Python shell, and and I can open files and then move around those files line by line. There's no concept of line wrapping because there's no margins, right? It's a virtually huge screen that has no
Oh, yeah.
physical, has no
You're super.
physical.
You're super right, though. I never thought of that way.
Yeah,
Like most of the visualizer, I use VS Code or Vim,
yeah,
depending on
yeah, yeah, yeah,
what I'm
yeah,
doing. But most of that is syntax highlighting and showing you the cursor, showing you the column you're on,
yeah, yeah.
matching parentheses,
Yep.
menus, and file search and whatnot. All of it is just visual.
Yeah, and well, mine's probably a little bit simplistic, but I do have, like if I'm on a left square bracket, I can jump to the corresponding right square bracket, and same for brackets and less than, greater than, those sorts of pairs of symbols, and but yeah, I'm not interested in how things wrap because there's no margins to worry about. It follows indenting. So if you've got indented code, I can skip to the line that matches that indent. So yeah, I've done a lot of those things, but it's at the character level and not having to worry at all about how does this look on a screen, because there isn't a screen to display it on. So that answers your question. It's just a Python shell, and it's strings that I can just pull out the words or characters or lines or sentences or whatever and send them to something to speak that, and I've got a Braille display as well, which um, also gives me Braille access to that same
Hmm.
whatever it is I'm working on.
Wow,
So
that's
Yeah,
fascinating.
I've moved away from editors like like VS Code and so on. I mean, I love text editors, but after doing that, I haven't been having to use them anymore apart from my own one, and just
Yeah, you
build
don't
whatever
really need them. That's
just
true.
build whatever features into that I need. Yeah, but like I said, it's the core of it is Python. So if I want a regular expression search or something like that, I'm just using the Python function for that.
Well, in a sense, what you could say, I am not an advanced Vim user, but I know people use, Vim has a lot of
Oh yes, yeah, for your
complex key
Unix.
bindings. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
It's got a lot of complex key bindings you can use. And I've seen people work on Vim where they were almost not looking at the screen, right? They're just
Yep.
putting in macro after macro, just
Yes.
jump to
Yeah.
next
Yeah.
line, go to here, go there, type this in. And it feels like it could be a good starting point for something
Yep.
because advanced
Yeah.
users really don't have to interact with the screen much.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. Look,
cool.
my first experience of something like that was right back in the 1980s, and I was on a digital equipment VAX machine,
Oh,
and there was an
nice.
editor on there called Tico, and that was entirely it was character by character, and the escape key was the key that you used to sort of get in and out of a function, and you could just think of it as characters, and you could move your cursor to or go and search for something, and then you didn't have to you didn't think in terms of the line you were on. You just thought in terms of where you were in the text, and then you could insert or delete at that point. And it was one of the first true character editors that I ever used. And in a sense, that's what I think that's really what Vim is like. um, and um, and the just the powerful use of macros and automating sequences has almost limitless.
Nice. Yeah,
And my
there's
editor
a
does
lot.
something similar. If I want to just record a sequence of keys, which I then want to just repeat or something, then it's very easy to do that.
Yeah, again, Vim does a lot of that. There's a way to immediately record a macro and immediately play it back, or play it back as many times as you want.
Yeah,
I
and
think
then
there's something there. I need to go, and I'm just curious to see if there's anything that's already been done.
I mean, there are certainly now. I have done some work on Linux, but Linux is not my strong point. And again, it because I want to be focused on a solution. I've always found whenever I've gone to Linux that I've had to get my head around all sorts of dependencies and go and look for them and make them, install them to make things work. And that has kind of always put me off, because I've always wanted to be focused on getting a particular job done, rather than
Mm.
have to spend a lot of time on that. But there are blind people who do that sort of stuff, so it's not as if I mean, and certainly Linux is quite accessible if you have the
Yeah.
right assembly of equipment or tools, or the appropriate voice screen readers, etc. It's certainly some very well established Linux blind guys that put me to shame when it comes to Linux, and they're using applications like that, but with some kind of speech device or something that's responding to them. Yeah.
I think Linux is interesting in that regard. uh, because there's a lot you can. So there is a common top trend here that many people say it's hard to get started. It's gotten much better recently. Like, if you
Yeah.
install a very modern Ubuntu distribution of all, it's the one I know best, but if you run a modern Ubuntu, it really just does it all. The screen
Sure.
reader,
Yeah.
I
Yeah. Yeah.
hear, isn't great, as if the
Yeah.
Apple and Windows are better,
Yeah.
but because
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
those are multi-billion-dollar companies and not
Yeah.
five
That's
people
right.
in a room.
Yeah.
But
That's
it's
that's right. And it's always been that sort of group of aficionados, really focused on that. But there's only so much they can do to make that work. But you can make it work, and that kind of opens up that whole world of, virtual machines and remotely accessing servers and things like that. Um, that's when people are really in their element, when with that kind of with that kind of system.
Well, yeah, there's yeah, again, people should probably be looking at Windows and Apple. Well, to be fair, the Apple operating system is great at accessibility. It allows
Oh
applications to
yeah.
request access to various parts of it. And it does. We You said you use that for automated testing, and you're absolutely correct. I've also used that for screen recording, audio recording, moving windows around. I use what's called a tiling desktop manager that moves my windows around with key
Yeah.
presses, and that's
Yes.
just part of the accessibility thing for
Yeah.
motor disabled people. Like,
Yes.
if you can't
Yes.
move in a certain way, you can move windows with that. It's great.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Linux, the open source community in general is great, and we're great at building a lot of stuff, but some of them require immense resources. One of them, unfortunately, being text to speech and speech to text, which are
Hmm.
historically not great in the open source domain because
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
require a huge amount of effort.
Yes.
So
And
that's it.
And look, I think one of the difficulties again, and it's also to do with a huge amount of effort, is documentation. It's always the documentation is always the last thing to get written. And to be honest, I would sometimes be quite frustrated by a FreeSWITCH where there was something I really needed to know, but I just couldn't find it documented. But so a certain amount of persistence paid off. Sometimes I would go onto the user's email list and get an answer from some of the people that are right into this doing it all the time. So documentation is a bit of a problem with open source, but then there are some very good examples of open source which is very well documented. So Apache or MySQL, I use both those, and they're both well regarded open source products, if you like, and manuals that someone has actually written a proper manual, or proper documentation page for something. And so that's an example, I guess, of a product that has been in the open source, had a long time to develop, and has become very mature, and
Most of the
with good
longest standing,
resources.
most of the
Yeah,
longest existing projects generally have good to great documentation. Of course,
yeah,
newer stuff, you don't even know if it's going to survive 6
yeah.
months, so you don't
No,
really.
exactly. And no one wants to write a whole. So WordPress's documentation has got really good. In my opinion, when I've needed to find something, I've found some good examples. And FreeSWITCH's documentation has certainly improved a lot since the beginning. And there's whole books about it now you can get. So yeah, these things mature over time, and
And the
yeah,
more help you get, the better you get, which is important.
yeah,
Also,
yeah,
many people
yeah, and
don't contribute too much and can
yeah,
be problematic on occasion.
sure.
Cool. So, well, Clive, thank you so much. It was great. We learned a lot, most of which I had absolutely no idea how things worked, and it was a pleasure talking to you. Really.
Cheers. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I hope people have enjoyed listening.
We'll have our conference in October in Chicago. If you'd like to join or join via streaming, it's at the start of it's from the 15th of October, I think, in Chicago. We'll go look at ClueCon.com if anybody would like to know more. I think there's still a sale going on up at the end of the month. And again, thank you, Clive Lansink, for joining us today.
And thank you.
And for the rest of the people, I'll see you next week. Goodbye.